This week's Bible study is on Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 20, and please read through the text before you listen to the video. It's hard to know where to begin today, as this passage is so familiar to people, even if they've never ever read the Bible or even been to church. But perhaps it's a good time to think about it, especially as we've spent the last few weeks in the wilderness with Moses and the Israelites. Perhaps having journeyed with the Israelites for a little while, we'll find some new perspectives on something that has been the basis of many legal systems all across the world. If we read this passage out of context, it's easy to see it as a list of rules or some kind of test of religious purity and devotion. But if we remember how it fits into the story of Moses, and even more broadly into the experience of the people of Israel, we can see it as a declaration from God that lies right at the heart of God's covenant relationship with God's people. This is the way in which the people show their acceptance of God's love and provision. This is the way in which the people say yes to God's liberation and salvation. The Ten Commandments are crucial in seeing how Israel understood its relationship with God. They're also vital in showing us that peace with God and peace with our neighbours are inextricably linked. It's impossible to have the former without the latter. In essence, it's the consummation of God's covenant relationship with Israel, and yet it's also something quite new. To get a sense of this newness, we need to take a step backwards and look at the end of chapter 19 from verse 16. We get an awe-inspiring, terrifying description of God's physical presence. The people are brought trembling out of their encampment in order to meet God, who has appeared amid fire and smoke and the shaking of the earth, and who speaks to Moses in a voice of thunder. How hard must it have been to stand there and watch and listen without running away in fear and terror? The build-up to the moment in which God gives the people the law emphasises just how significant and important this will be. So it's a new thing, but it's also more than that. We can see the giving of the Ten Commandments also as a continuation of all that has gone before. Where we are today in this reading is at a point in the path that began at the burning bush way back in Exodus chapter 3. There, God called Moses to be the instrument of God's great liberation within Israel's life. And even then, God was drawing on points of continuity. God told Moses that I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in chapter 3, verse 6. And shortly after, Moses has to announce this to the people. The covenant that God forges on Mount Sinai is not a new venture, in that it perpetuates and deepens the relationship that goes all the way back to Abraham. It affirms that God's redeeming activity is indeed ongoing. Covenant is the key word here. These commands don't appear from nowhere with no attention to context. God's instructions are not the orders of a master to slaves, but rather they're God's gracious gift to the people. Through this gift of love and grace, the people have a means to respond to God's love. The people can use these commands to show God their love and their acceptance of all that God is and all that God does. Brian McLaren describes the 10 plagues as the way God got the people out of slavery, and the 10 commands as the way God got slavery out of the people. By signing up to these commands, Israel could acknowledge God's love and faithfulness, could affirm their status as special in God's eyes, and could express their love and commitment to the God who proved that they were no longer captive and oppressed slaves, but were now God's own liberated people. A lot has been said about the negative language of the Ten Commandments, and a lot can be read into this. But it's important to realise that this was the traditional form of legal documentation in the ancient world at the time that the book of Exodus was written. If we focus too much on the negative phrasing, then we might be tempted to think that our faithfulness to our relationship with God, our love and commitment to God, is proved simply by what we don't do. Yet most important is the fact that Jesus gives us quite the opposite impression. Jesus shows us that when the legal language is removed, there is a much more positive slant on these commands. Love God unreservedly and love your neighbour as you love yourself. It's been pointed out that the very fact that Jesus relies on the Old Testament text to make his point shows that the Torah as a positive force was well understood in ancient Israel. Paul talks about the law in his letters and highlights the problems that even the most faithful people experience in responding fully to God's love. Idolatry in many forms distracts us from devotion to God, and a concern for ourselves over others has a detrimental effect on social and personal relationships. Only if we're empowered by the Holy Spirit can we begin to approach the purpose for which the Ten Commandments were originally given. Only with the help of the Holy Spirit can the commandments help us give a faithful response of love to God. The Holy Spirit helps us to see that even our response to God's loving presence is only made possible because of God's gracious activity in our lives. The dependence on the Spirit is important to acknowledge. It illustrates our own weakness and need for God, but it also opens us up to even bigger gestures of love that go far beyond the letter of the law. When we're inspired to live out the spirit of the law rather than the letter, we are truly set free. Brian McLaren paraphrased the Ten Commandments with an emphasis on them as a way for us to respond to the liberating love and activity of God. And here they are. Put the God of liberation first, not the gods of slavery, like fear, rage, food, alcohol, consumerism, shame, lust, inferiority, and control. Don't reduce God to the manageable size of an idol, certainly not one made of wood or stone by human hands, and not one made by human minds of rituals and words either, and certainly not one in whose name people are enslaved, dehumanized, and excluded or killed. Don't use God for your own agenda by throwing around God's holy name. If you make a vow in God's name, keep it. Honour the God of liberation by taking and giving everyone a day off. Don't keep the old 24/7 slave economy going. Turn from self-centeredness by honouring your parents. After all, honour is the basis of freedom. Don't kill people, and don't do things that frequently incite violence, including don't cheat with other spouses, don't steal others' possessions, and don't lie about others' behaviour and characters. In fact, if you really want to avoid the violence of the old slave economy, deal with its root source, the drama of desire. Don't let the competitive desire to acquire tempt you off the road of freedom. If you would like to think about this passage a bit further, read through that biblical passage again and reflect on the biblical text and also on the paraphrased version of the Ten Commandments that I've just read. Does anything strike you in the language or in the imagery used in the paraphrase? How do you respond to the idea that the commandments were intended by God to give us a means to respond to God's love and to commit ourselves to relationship with God? How do you respond to the idea that we can only truly keep the commandments according to the spirit in which they were intended if the Holy Spirit lives in us? What do you think about the idea that the commandments have a positive drive rather than a list of negative don'ts? Can you think of any other commands that would be relevant today if God were giving us this list for the first time?